Hi everyone, this is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and this is another daily astro video blog. Let's see, it's December 27th, and I'm sitting down at my computer to record a little talk on some of January's upcoming astrology. In particular, in this video, I'm going to focus on the fact that we have an old Venus in the sky right now, and that our old Venus is moving toward a conjunction with the Sun and Pluto on January 9th. It's an incredibly auspicious and powerful transit for a couple of reasons, all of which I'm going to mention today during our talk. So we're going to talk about what is old Venus, what does it mean that Venus is going to conjoin the Sun, and what does it mean when Venus is cazimi in particular, because this Sun-Pluto-Venus transit that we're going to have on January 9th, which is, we're just starting to build toward it now, this conjunction between these three planets will also feature Venus being at the heart of the Sun. So it's a very unique transit for a lot of reasons. So let me just pull open my chart. Yes, so it'll be, let's see, right now Venus is at about 3 degrees of Capricorn. And as we head into the new year, this is definitely the big transit to watch in the month ahead, because Venus is only about 3 degrees away from the Sun, but will move into a conjunction with the Sun, but it's going to do so on January 9th, and I'll actually give you the exact time so that you can kind of know what you're getting into here. Here we go. So it's January 9th on the East Coast. It's like early afternoon on the East Coast of January 9th. At that time, Venus will be at the heart of the Sun, which is called cazimi. That occurs when Venus is within about 15 minutes of an exact conjunction to the Sun, which means every degree of the zodiac, there's 360 degrees. Every sign has 30 degrees, and every degree of every sign is comprised of 60 subunits that we call minutes. So Venus will be within that special 15-minute range of an exact conjunction with the Sun at the same time that they are all within about 30 minutes of an exact conjunction with Pluto. So you've got a Sun, Pluto, Venus triple conjunction while all of these planets are in Capricorn, and Saturn has just ingressed into Capricorn, its home sign. So it's a very big deal. Just to give you a sense of the sort of enormousness of the transit in time, I had to go back to 1771 before I could find such a close triple conjunction in Capricorn with these three planets. So the last time that you see Venus, the Sun, and Pluto together in Capricorn that closely, and it's not even as close as this one, right? It's 1771. We're going to talk about what happened in 1771 in a little bit. Going back before that, there's an even closer one back in 1532. And I'm also going to talk about what happened in 1532. So, but just to give you guys a sense of the scope, you know, it takes Pluto a heck of a long time to go around the Sun. So its stay in Capricorn is long, slow, but it's also rare. It doesn't, you know, it's not like it's hanging out in Capricorn all that often, really, in terms of its full cycle. So 1532, 1771, and neither of these last two times that Pluto and Venus and the Sun all got together were they at the same degree. Was Venus cazimi with the Sun, and was Venus starting a new synodic cycle with the Sun. So this is truly historically, it seems like sort of mundane, like, oh, Venus, Pluto, and the Sun. You know, like we've spent a lot of time talking about mundane transits like Uranus square Pluto, right? Or we talk about, you know, Jupiter opposite Uranus, like big, long, slow-moving, heavy planets that go back and forth in squares or oppositions to each other over a long period of time. And we spend a lot of time talking about those in terms of from a historical point of view. They're like seasons of large political upheaval, like we saw last year with Jupiter Uranus and the election and the Million Women March, and you know, the Me Too movement, and like, so there's all of this like that, and that's like very common when we talk about mundane transits that affect sort of everyone. We look at the slower moving long transits, and we don't often pay a lot of attention to fast moving transits like a Venus Sun Pluto conjunction. We're like, oh yeah, like on a Venus Sun Pluto conjunction, like that might be pretty intense for love and relationships for a day or something like that, right? But it's actually much, much more significant when you put together all of the details of a transit, and then you also see the rareness of these transits. Like, it's incredibly rare for Venus to be cazimi, conjoined with the Sun, starting a new synodic cycle, co-present with Saturn, her ruler, and exactly conjoined with Pluto. Like, that's actually super, super rare. So it's not always the length of the transit, like, you know, Uranus Pluto in the 60s. It becomes this season of massive cultural revolution, or, you know, the Uranus Pluto square over the past 7 or 8 years is this massive, like, long historical period of things happening. This kind of a mundane transit, it's more like important events will occur. We may not even be aware of them right away, but they will end up being some of the most powerful, transformative, singular, dynamic events that lead to greater changes in time. And it's these things you always have to pay attention to when analyzing the bigger transits as well. For example, during this transit on January 9th, if you pay attention to the astrology, you'll notice that Uranus is just stationed and turned direct. And this is about the closest that Pluto, Pluto and Uranus will be in about a 5-degree square or so from one another. So you have, you know, here's Pluto-Uranus, which is all about massive sort of transformation, revolution, death and rebirth, and you're just seeing it like all over the world. It's like in the environmental movement, the crazy politics, that, you know, it's just like, just turn on the news, right? And you can see Uranus Pluto at work. But when you look at within those transits, within that 8 years or whatever, when you pay attention to, oh yeah, and as they're squared to one another, there are going to be these moments like a cardinal grand cross in the midst of 8 years worth of, you know, Uranus and Pluto, or there's going to be a T-square at a particular time. This is another one of those triggering events. It's faster, it doesn't last very long, but it's a trigger event within the larger scope of the Pluto-Uranus dynamic. That's another way of looking at it. So, incredibly rare transit. Let's start breaking it down and talking about what each piece of it means. All right, so whenever Venus is at the very end of its synodic cycle with the Sun, meaning it's going through a sort of full, sort of cyclical relationship with the Sun, and that occurs as Venus goes from evening star, retrogrades, conjoins the Sun, sort of goes backward in the order of zodiac, retrogrades behind the Sun in zodiacal order, and then stations, moves forward again as the morning star, and then eventually conjoins the Sun again, and then will start to rise again as the evening star, and the cycle starts over. Whenever Venus is approaching the Sun from behind the Sun in zodiacal order in direct motion, she's about to conjoin the Sun and start a new cycle. And that phase of her life cycle is thought of as old. Like, she's an old Venus, she's a wise Venus, she's a more mature Venus, she's been around, she's seen things, she's like the crone Venus or the elder Venus. So, and to some extent the dying Venus. So we have the image of an old or sort of dying Venus in Capricorn, which is Saturn's sign. So it really is a more mature, perhaps more conservative Venus. Those are things to just think about. And then as she gets closer and closer to the Sun, she goes through a kind of death and rebirth experience where when she finally conjoins the Sun, which is happening on, you know, roughly January 9th, then the cycle starts over. So it's like this injection, especially when Venus is within that 15 minutes of an exact conjunction called cazimi. It's at the heart of the Sun. It's as though it's like a sick person. Sometimes it's discussed, you'll hear people talk about it like a sick person who gets out of bed for the first time after being basically laid to waste by a fever, right? It's like, my fever has broken and I'm getting up out of bed for the first time. And I'm starting to feel a little bit better. I'm starting to feel, you know, like I've got my legs beneath me again. I'm starting to recover. I'm not well yet, right? But I've come through the worst of it and I'm starting a new life cycle, right? That's sort of what it's compared to sometimes. Another way that it's thought of is when Venus or any planet is at the heart of the sun, it's as though they have executive privilege, like a president or a king or a queen sending a messenger or an ambassador with full executive privilege to negotiate or something like that. So the planet is like infused with the power and authority of the sun, which is like related to rulership and authority and things like that. Powerful people. So you have those kinds of symbols floating around at the same time that Venus is sort of recovering and starting a new cycle. And then what's happening is they're getting together with Pluto, right? So Pluto, right? Lord of death and rebirth. So when you have both Venus and the sun getting together with Pluto, that's where the whole thing really ramps up, right? Because you've got Lord of the underworld, Hades, related both to corruption, darkness, and evil in one sense, but also related to purgation, transformation of the soul, the sort of dark night of the soul, and the meeting of the soul with God, something completely transcendent. And this happens in and through the darkness. And this is a perennial part of the mystical experience. So when you have Venus and the sun going into Hades together, we can see some things that are really gnarly and dark and destructive and sort of terrible. But you can also see this kind of transcendental rebirth quality that's happening. Sometimes both at the same time. You go into the darkness, you come out, you emerged into the light, sort of renewed, reinvigorated, re-inspired, reborn, re-empowered. Pluto can be like, I think I heard Liz Green one time say, and I love this, that Pluto, Pluto's sort of like finding the place where there's an infection in the body that you're not aware of. Like, oh my God, I didn't know that my foot has gangrene, right? I better cut it off before it infects the whole body. That might seem like an extreme metaphor, but that's what Pluto can be like. So think about that as well. We have this total cathartic moment for the two of them approaching, right as this old Venus is being born again, right as she's being empowered, etc. Okay, now, and then you also remember also that they have a lot of Saturnine power right now. Okay, because they're in Saturn's sign and because Saturn is there too. So there's a lot of like super Saturn power behind all of this going on. Now, that might seem like a lot to synthesize, so let's try to give you some examples from history of how this has played out in world events in the two recent time periods that I mentioned. So if you go back to 1771, I'm going to slaughter this woman's name, unfortunately, but Empress Go Sakuramachi was the 117th monarch of Japan. Now, when this transit was happening for her, Venus was coming back to conjoin the sun through a retrograde. So this time it's a totally different part of Venus's cycle. But you had a Venus retrograde with Pluto and the sun together, very close. Not as close as this one, but very close. And you had the first female emperor of Japan in nearly 1,000 years that was forced to abdicate the throne to a man. So she was allowed, because I don't remember the exact story, but it was like she was allowed to take the throne after her brother died, something like that. So she takes the throne. She was not allowed to rule, only to reign. So basically they had guys ruling while they just gave her the title. Kind of crappy. And then when at some point a child was born or something in the family, there was some shift and there was a male available to take the throne. And so they forced her to abdicate at this time. So you have this, there's just a very simple symbol. I could have mined for more, but I wanted to just give a very simple example of the empowerment of the feminine and the disempowerment of the feminine, both present in this transit. I'll give you another example. The other one that I looked at that the last time that we saw this in Capricorn was going back to 1532. And in 1532, one of the interesting things that happens is King Henry VIII, if you know this whole drama, King Henry VIII is trying to pursue a divorce with Catherine of Aragon so that he can marry Anne Boleyn. So if you guys, I don't know if any of you know the story, but this was huge because it was actually in this month of January when this triple conjunction got together, and this one was closer. Plus, this one was actually a new moon, so this was a pretty unique one in 1532. The Pope would not annul his divorce, wouldn't annul the marriage, and what happened as a result is basically the breaking of the Catholic Church's power in England, because the Pope is from Rome, right? And King Henry eventually gets someone like a local bishop or something to basically usurp the power of the Pope and marry them and annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and then allow for, or perform the marriage with Anne Boleyn. And that marriage would represent the first break of the Church of England from Rome, from the power and authority of the Pope in Rome. And that would in turn eventually lead to the king sort of having power over the Church of England, which is a huge, huge deal. I mean, you're talking about the division of church and state. You're talking about something that will eventually set the stage for major social and political fissures in England. So it's a huge deal, and it's all based around, in some sense, it's based around King Henry's like lust and desiring of this woman. And then he wants a son, right? And Anne Boleyn gives birth to who will eventually become Queen Elizabeth I, but then she also has several miscarriages trying to give him a boy. And he gets tired of her and starts courting Jane Seymour and has her executed. So a lot of people have probably seen the other Boleyn Girl, if you've ever seen that film, or there's some really good, Hollywood stuff out there. A lot of people have probably seen it. Anyway, so there's like a major, and that one's closer to the nature of this one. So I'm more inclined from a just objective research perspective to say, I think that this transit is going to be, so here are the things you can look at. You can look at conservative empowerment, control and government, relationship, sexuality, and power. And you can look at things like control and how certain kinds of political / sexual dynamics and tensions have a huge role to play in politics and in possibly even in things like the ruling institutions of society. So we're in the midst of this Me Too movement right now, right? But this is a big transit. It's something here is happening that probably will have echoes of similar kinds of political, sexual drama and tension. So does that make sense to everybody? People who are listening, does that sort of, that the connections maybe not super obvious right away? We're going to talk a little bit more about this, but for now, I think probably the good thing to think about is just, knowing that under previous transits, you have the issues of women in power, of political and social structures, of women, of sex, of manipulation, coercion with the feminine, stuff like that. So it's, there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. So that's like from the mundane standpoint, that's what you can think about. Here are a list of things that you could watch for. You have women being empowered. Venus is at the heart of the sun. She's given like executive privilege, and she's also conjoined with Pluto. So this may be a big moment of feminine goddess like uprising, like supercharged feminine empowerment, sort of that Kali, destructive feminine potentially, or perhaps a very conservative feminine empowerment, which is unique because you have Saturn just having ingressed into Capricorn, and Saturn is there along with these other planets. So women in power, conservative empowerment generally, with the potential for some kind of coercion or manipulation of relationships. Remember that Venus rules relationships generally, right? So Venus is friendship, harmony, contracts, agreements, kind words, friendship, and all kinds of allegiances, all Venus. So when Venus and the sun get together, Venus is dying, being reborn, hitting Pluto. You're looking at the potential for severing of, like, it would not surprise me at all if under this transit you saw Bob Mueller fired in the FBI investigation, for example, or if you saw pardons given by the president to people under this transit, where it's super political, it's really underworld, Hades stuff, kind of stuff going on. You have that kind of executive privilege to Venus being granted. So I think you could see that kind of stuff for sure. But you can think of the breaking and remaking of sacred contracts, friendships, and relationships in general. You'll start to see that building now. The tension has already been building for just the past couple of days or so. You'll see that continue to build, that can carry over into romance and love, where there's a serious level of evaluation, death and rebirth within romantic relationships, within friendships, within work relationships, longstanding contracts or agreements that you have with people. The keywords diplomacy and betrayal, betrayal of trust, betrayal of confidence, as well as a sort of vindictiveness, things that on one level appear like a diplomatic move, but are actually, really underhanded, like super soap opera stuff we could see going on with, like, giving with one hand while you take away with the other. It's super Venus Pluto. But then, and remember, you have a pretty empowered Venus too, and Venus is not without her wiles. Like, she's not all like, like finger painting, apple pie, and like friendship at the pool. She's got, like, she can get up to no good just like any other planet. Let's see. Conflict, death, and rebirth in relationships, major aesthetic or creative transformations, whether that's lifestyle, health, diet, clothing, just your general aesthetic, that can go through a really big transformation. You might be empowered. This is not a bad time for people who are in the arts to find themselves potentially getting grants, or people who are in need of some kind of support for a creative endeavor, finding a powerful level of support. I would also add, be careful of what you sign up for, because Pluto in the midst of all of this could signal somebody who wants more than what they're saying, right? So you got to be careful of that. Understanding the truth of something that's been hidden, finding the truth. Pluto, Venus, the sun are often about clarity, sun, of hidden truth in relationships of all kinds, Venus and Pluto. So when Venus comes into the light of the sun, conjoins, and you have that deep eruption of Plutonian force, you come to realize something about the nature of a friend, of a relationship. There can also be eruptions from the unconscious, generally related to sex or sexuality, attraction. You can be approached or approach others inappropriately outside of the appropriate boundaries, like approaching a married person or being approached by a married person. Not uncommon for a transit like this. Usually there are healthy ways of expressing our truth, and there are less healthy ways. So we got to really be aware of all of that. Don't forget, in the middle of all of this, Pluto is in a square to Uranus. So this is ultimately a part of a greater story of liberation happening both culturally and personally. We have to trust that larger narrative in which this sort of little epicenter event is taking place. These events could serve to loosen or transform more rigid structures in the psyche, in our lives, in our karma over time. So don't underestimate this event, because even though it may not seem like a big deal on the day that it occurs, the kinds of things that happen as we're leading up to this event and right after it in January, listen, when King Henry got the letter in 1532 in January from the Pope, or when he's communicating with the Pope, you can actually read online some of the letters. When he's communicating with the Pope and realizing the Pope isn't going to annul his divorce, well, that's a similar event. It was like a correspondence that took place, right? But it leads to the breaking of the Church of England from Rome, and the king taking over, in a sense, power of the church in England. That's huge. And eventually this woman who he wants to marry, he ends up killing, right? He ends up executing her. So it's like the seeds being planted now, basically you're going to get beheaded. Sorry. Just kidding. So no, nobody's gonna get beheaded, hopefully. But maybe some egos might get a little beheaded. That happens. All right. So at any rate, don't forget that Mars and Jupiter will be coming together in Scorpio at the same time. So holy cow, just days before this happens, like literally I think it's the 6th of January, Mars conjoins Jupiter in Scorpio, suggesting things like militarism, dictators, empowerment of emotional truth, emotional confrontation, etc. So, and a kind of brazen, like hubris, like Zeus on steroids, right? Which Zeus doesn't need any steroids. So you're pumping Zeus up with Mars, and you've got that in this dark watery sign of Scorpio, all hanging out in a sextile to the Pluto Sun Venus thing that's coming together. So it's an empowering time perhaps, but it's also, a lot of people who are in power in the world, probably we would all agree, don't need any more of it. You know what I mean? And that unfortunately is potentially part of the story we're looking at. Again, the silver lining is that we're really in the midst of this Pluto-Uranus square, which is in the end, I think, very liberating. So it may not happen right away, but we're looking probably at some events in the next couple of weeks that will be, really pivotal turning points in a larger story. So best advice given all of this. Well, first of all, as in every astrological transit, there really is no advice. And that's the simple and most honest level of truth, because for the large part, ancient astrologers believed that, like yogis, believed that this world that we're in is bound up in cause and effect, and that a lot of what we are looking at is stuff that is destined. It's fated. It's a part of the karmic realm of cause and effect, which is like a cycling wheel that ultimately is pretty scientific and pretty predictable. Now, it's pretty magical how we predict things in astrology, if you think about that. And that implies greater realities that are obviously co-present with this realm of fate and karma and cause and effect. But largely, human life, insofar as we're nothing but attached to the material world and its fruits, are very predictable creatures. And so the first advice is no advice. It's just, this is the karma. This is the destiny. Live it, love it, try to be present and conscious for it. So whatever is going to happen is going to happen. But I'm also not a fatalist, right? So in ancient world, you can think of fate like a little circle. We're all inside the material realm, which is the realm of fate, which is the realm of karma, cause and effect cyclically. But within this circle is held inside of a much bigger circle. And that circle is the realm of God's providence, which is like saying, when we say the universe does this or the universe does that, or we say like God's angels intervened, or we say that there was divine intervention of any kind in our life. Ancient astrologers also believed that ultimately fate was in the hands of the larger sphere of providence. So our actions do matter. Being a good person does matter. Doing the best we can does matter. Praying, meditating, taking care of your body, trying to be a good person, these things do matter. They may or may not be able to alter our fate. They may or may not. We may have a karmic lesson to learn that's ultimately not something we can control. The goal, anyway, was never, from the standpoint of these mystical traditions, the goal has never been to try to use your free will to manipulate the realm of fate, right? Not toward, getting a Mercedes, not toward trying to eliminate suffering, but rather the use of free will is in cultivating a mindful and conscious, loving relationship with this world that we're in. And as we do that, we do have the power to transform our karma in this world, so that slowly the material life that we live does in fact become more reflective of divine things, joy, peace, patience, etc. So we do have to do that work. But when we look at a transit like this, we get all these things going on, and we're like, what do I do? What do I do? Ultimately, the most important thing is to try to be peaceful in your heart, to be content to accept whatever spiritual lessons or karma might be involved, and then to also trust that your consciousness, your conscious relationship to these events is very, very important. It's significant, and it is a part of the relationship to God's higher intelligence or God's providence. How how the universe may or may not intervene. I think it's really important to mention that it's not like, oh, well, if you're good enough, then the universe intervenes or something like that. It's not that simple, but it's just to say that our actions really do matter, and that nothing is outside of the power of the divine to intervene in ways that are completely contrary to whatever the fates are telling us. So these are the fates that we're looking at, right? How can we bring our full heart and our full consciousness to bear on these fates as they pass into and through our lives? I hope that this has been helpful for everybody. Remember, as anything's coming up in relationships that are related to all these themes, just trying to be patient with one another and to stay humble. It's at Venus, Pluto, Sun, pretty empowering, pretty intense transit. It's very easy to get up on a high horse in relationships, especially if you really are in the right. A lot of times in relationships, like we've actually been wronged, or someone is actually not good for us, or someone, we feel empowered to get out of a relationship or to speak the truth to someone or whatever. It's not an excuse for treating people poorly or for getting high on ourselves. That's the most important thing I could say about this transit is whatever truth has to come up from the underworld with Venus, Pluto, and the Sun, however empowering or enlightening it may be, it's not an excuse to get high on ourselves. So at any rate, I hope you all have, I just am over 30 minutes. That was my goal for today. I hope you guys all have a great rest of your week and a happy new year. I will be doing another longer video cast on the astrology of 2018 and covering some farther off transits for the year ahead in that talk, which I'll probably do later this week before New Year's or maybe on New Year's Day. We'll see. All right, guys, take care. Bye.